Number 1.
An accomplice of notorious rape and murder ring, the family has revealed how the group drugged and raped teenage hitchhikers. Prominent Sydney gay identity Lewis Turner admitted he let his acquaintance Bevan Spencer von Einem bring drugged boys to his home in the early 1970s. Von Einem was jailed for life in 1984 for the murder of Richard Kelvin, 15, who was held captive, drugged, tortured, and repeatedly raped for 5 weeks until he died. The now 73-year-old monster is suspected of killing 4 other teenagers and the family, of torturing and killing up to 150 in the mid-1970s to early 1980s. He, to this day, denies all the murders and blames Richard for his own death. He was charged with killing 2 others, but the cases collapsed. Mr. Turner said he knew von Einem well before the murders began, and all the boys left his home alive the morning after they were drugged, but during the night they were raped by von Einem and other men who took turns with them. Mr. Turner has admitted to having sex with 2 of them. How did they give consent? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know, he told upcoming Foxtel podcast Frozen Lies. All I know, they came, he dropped them off at our place. He went home. We let them sleep it off. They left in the morning. The program got suppression orders on 5 men linked to the family lifted, including Mr. Turner's housemates, drag queens Prudence Furman and Noel Torrance Brooks. Mr. Turner, the brother of Olympic cycling gold medalist Mike Turner, said von Einem would pick up the boys as they hitchhiked, then bring them to his home. There they would be given a spiked drink and taken inside Mr. Turner's home, where the abuse would begin. I was a stupid fool, wasn't I, he admitted. Mr. Turner said he was in the car several times when von Einem picked up hitchhiking boys, but couldn't remember much of how it was done. Half the time I was drugged out anyway, so I don't really care. I was in my own little world, he said. Mr. Turner said he didn't know of von Einem's alleged murders until much later, and told police his suspicions during the investigations. Frozen Lies managed to interview von Einem for the first time in decades, but he still refused to confess, even as his health deteriorated from type 2 diabetes. I'm not a killer, for starters. I didn't do it. Yes, I picked up hitchhikers, but I didn't harm them, he said. Von Einem then blamed Richard, the son of Channel 9 newsreader Rob Kelvin, for his death, claiming he was actually gay. Everyone painted him as this straight boy, but he wasn't. His father was in the media and they wanted to get the message out that he was straight, he said. However, von Einem also made a telling error during the interview, admitting to have seen Richard wearing a dog collar he'd put on as a joke, but taken off at a bus stop before being kidnapped. This was a key point in his murder trial, and at the time von Einem denied seeing him wear it. He has now contradicted his testimony. If von Einem saw the collar on him, then he was stalking him at the bus stop, or put it back on him after the abduction. Though he refused to confess his crimes, the remorseless killer spoke in great detail about how his harsh father's friend raped him when he was 7. In an effort to convict him of more of the murders, police in 2014 examined the diary of Trevor Peters, who died last year, lived next door to 2 cross-dressers who assisted von Einem, possibly 2 of Mr. Turner, Mr. Furman, and Mr. Brooks. Peters, who was gay and mixed in the same circles as von Einem and the cross-dressers, says in his diary he saw photographs of one of the family murder victims, Alan Barnes, in von Einem's possession. Peters said in June 1979, he was at the same hairdressing salon as von Einem and another man. The pair was giggling and saying, "Whoa, how evil," and "oh, it's evil," over a group of between 4 and 6 Polaroid photographs of an attractive young blonde-haired man, pictured in the front seat of a car. Peters later recognized the man as Alan Barnes, after seeing newspaper stories about his abduction. Barnes was last seen on June 17, 1979, while hitchhiking, being picked up by a white Holden sedan with 3 or 4 people in it. His hideously mutilated corpse was found dumped a week later on the banks of a reservoir north of Adelaide.
Number 2.
Glasgow city centre might not seem like a particularly spooky place, but it's hiding a dark secret. 4 of Scotland's most infamous murders took place within an area of 1 square mile, stretching between Blisswood Square, South Street and Charing Cross. Although there seems to be no connection between the murders, some have suggested that this abnormal concentration of high-profile murder cases points to the area being cursed, taking place between 1847 and 1908. The murders ranged from poisonings to brutal attacks with a meat cleaver. The area was given its nickname, the Square Mile of Murder, by journalist and author Jack House in 1961. A deadly affair. Madeline Smith was a well-to-do socialite in Victorian Glasgow, but her reputation was ruined after she was accused of murdering her lover. The Smith family, including 20-year-old Madeline, lived at No. 7 Blythewood Square. In 1855, Smith began a secret affair with Pierre-Émile Langelier, an apprentice nurseryman who had moved to Glasgow from the Channel Islands. As well as writing each other love letters, the pair often met secretly in Smith's bedroom, and they had even promised to marry each other. Unaware of this, her parents had found a suitable match for her, William Harper Minich, an upstanding upper-middle-class man who also lived on Blythewood Square. After nearly 2 years of conducting their affair in secret, Smith decided to end her tryst with Langelier and asked him to return their love letters. He refused and threatened to use the letters to expose the couple's secret, blackmailing Smith into marrying him. Smith was then seen in a local chemist shop ordering arsenic, and, suspiciously, Langelier was found dead just a few days later. The cause of death: arsenic poisoning. After his death, Smith's letters were found in Langelier's boarding house, and she immediately became the prime suspect. Despite the circumstantial evidence pointing towards Smith's guilt, there were no eyewitnesses and no definite proof that she murdered her lover, so the jury at her trial returned a verdict of not proven. That didn't necessarily mean Smith was innocent, just that there wasn't enough evidence to prove she was guilty. To this day, many people still believe that Madeline Smith was the murderer. The next murder to take place within the Square Mile of Murder was the Sandyford case of 1862. Jessie McPherson, a servant, was brutally murdered with a meat cleaver at 17 Sandyford Place. McPherson had stab wounds all over her body, including long, deep gashes across her forehead and the back of her head, which had cut through the bone. There was blood all over the bedroom, lobby and kitchen, and some of the victim's clothing and belongings, as well as some silverware from the house, had been stolen. But, strangely, the kitchen and bedroom floors had recently been washed, as had the face, chest and neck of the corpse, with bloody footprints still visible. However, the murderer had done a pretty bad job of cleaning up the crime scene. The Sandyford murder was the first Scottish police case in which forensic photography was used to help solve the crime. The first suspect was James Fleming, the father of the owner of 17 Sandyford Place. Fleming was staying alone in the house at the time of the murder, and, given his previous history of getting a servant girl pregnant, it was thought that he may have murdered McPherson after she refused his amorous advances. A pawnbroker, who had read the story in the newspaper, said he had received the missing silverware from a woman called Mary MacDonald, a name sometimes used by Jessie McLachlan, a former servant at 17 Sandyford Place and best friend of the victim. McLachlan was arrested and gave a statement to police, but they found that most of what she said was a lie. The discovery of blood-stained clothing in her house made the suspect seem even more guilty. The Sandyford murder was the first Scottish police case in which forensic photography was used to help solve the crime. Police asked McLachlan to place her foot in a bucket of cow's blood and then step on a plank of wood. They then matched this bloody footprint to a photograph of one at the murder scene. Despite McLachlan maintaining her innocence, she was convicted of the murder and sentenced to death. Due to public outcry, this was reduced to life imprisonment. Many experts now think she was innocent, and her story of walking in on Mr. Fleming while he was murdering McPherson might just have been true. Edward William Pritchard was a doctor who lived at 11 Berkeley Street in Glasgow. He was convicted of murdering 2 people, but is also suspected of killing a 25-year-old servant who died in a fire at the house in 1863. Pritchard then moved to 131 South Street, now number 249, along with his wife and mother-in-law. Shortly after she discovered him having an affair with another servant girl, Pritchard's wife, Mary Jane, fell ill. Her husband diagnosed her with a gastric fever. As time went on, Mary Jane only seemed to be getting worse, and her mother also became very ill. Pritchard was reluctant to get any other doctors involved, but at the request of Mary Jane, local Dr. James Patterson, concluded that they were both under the influence of opium. He had no idea that Pritchard had been slowly administering large amounts of antimony, a toxic poison, to both women over several months. Mary Jane died in March 1865, a month after her mother had also passed away. Pritchard signed the death certificates without an autopsy and cited gastric fever as the cause of death. At his wife's funeral, Pritchard was seen to be crying inconsolably and even asked for the coffin to be opened one more time so he could kiss his dead wife. Crying crocodile tears at both the funeral and his later trial, Pritchard earned the nickname of the human crocodile. An anonymous letter was sent to the police following Mary Jane's death, thought to be from another local doctor who had been suspicious of Pritchard's actions. The bodies were exhumed, and an autopsy found evidence of excessive amounts of antimony poison. Pritchard was consequently arrested and convicted of murder. After a 5-day trial, the human crocodile was the last person to be publicly executed in Glasgow, in front of several thousand spectators at Glasgow Green, on 28 July 1865. In December 1908, 83-year-old Marion Gilchrist was violently beaten to death in her home at 49 West Princes Street during a robbery. Despite having thousands of pounds worth of jewelry hidden in her wardrobe, a neighbor disturbed the thief, and they only took off with one brooch. Police suspected a man called Oscar Slater, who claimed to be a gymnastics instructor, dentist and dealer in precious stones, but was known to the authorities as a pimp and a gangster. Slater, originally from Germany, was born Oscar Lechziner, but changed his name to Oscar Anderson, and then later Oscar Slater, after moving to the UK. A few days before Gilchrist's murder, a stranger had called at the victim's house looking for someone called Anderson. This, coupled with a pawn ticket for a brooch under his name, which later turned out to be false, and the fact that he left Glasgow for New York 5 days after the murder, was enough to make Slater the main suspect. Slater was advised to return to Scotland, and a jury found him guilty of the murder, but not everyone thought he was guilty. Lawyer and amateur criminologist William Roughead found many flaws in the prosecution's case. There was a great deal of circumstantial evidence used to convict Slater, including his flight from justice, despite a witness testifying that the accused had organized the trip to America weeks before the murder took place. Roughead also argued that the police had provided unreliable, prejudiced or coached evidence. For example, during an identity parade, Slater was placed alongside 9 upstanding, smartly dressed off-duty policemen. It would have been obvious to anyone who the supposed criminal was, said Roughead. After spending 19 years in prison, Slater was released and awarded £6,000, equivalent to approximately £330,000 today, in compensation. The real murderer has never been found.
Number 3.
Hitashi Igarashi, who was the first Japanese scholar to translate Salman Rushdie's book The Satanic Verses, was found dead under mysterious circumstances in 1991. Since then, several translators of the controversial book have faced physical attacks. The 1988 book, which was published by Viking Penguin on 26 September 1988 in the UK, and on 22 February 1989 in the US, became instantly controversial in Islamic communities because of what some Muslims considered blasphemous references. A year after the novel's release, in 1989, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa, or religious ruling, ordering Muslims to kill the author. Mr. Rushdie was put under round-the-clock security from 1989 to 2002, when a $3 million bounty was put on his head. Apart from Mr. Rushdie, many others affiliated with the book in one way or another were also targeted. The death of Igarashi is still unsolved. The Norwegian publisher of The Satanic Verses, William Nygaard, was also shot 3 times on his back on 11 October 1993. He reportedly survived the shooting but spent months in the hospital recovering. The shooters were never caught. Italian translator Ettore Capriolo was beaten and attacked with a knife by a man who said he was Iranian at his home in Milan, and sustained critical injuries on his neck, chest, and hands. But days later, the Italian law enforcement ruled out any connection between the assault and Rushdie's book The Satanic Verses. In 1993, Islamic militants set fire to a hotel in eastern Turkey in a plot to kill author Aziz Nesin, who who translated this book into the Turkish language. In 1993, while Mr. Nesson was attending a symposium in the conservative eastern city of Sivas, one of his remarks was leaked, and the senior author became the target of an unparalleled barrage of hate. Hundreds of Islamists came out of mosques and gathered in the city's central plaza, where they stoned police barriers and governmental structures. They flashed arms and shouted Islamic slogans as their numbers grew throughout the day. An enraged Muslim mob set fire to a hotel in eastern Turkey, where Mr. Nesson had sought shelter. Crowds around the hotel also made it difficult for the fire services to contain the incident. Mr. Nesson was forced to flee using a fire department ladder as the rescue crews arrived. He was treated for minor injuries and transported out of the state after escaping from the hotel in a police van. However, at least 35 individuals were killed and 60 were injured. Mr. Rushdie was stabbed on stage at the Chautauqua Institution in New York State on Friday, just as he was about to give a lecture. He suffered serious injuries and is in hospital, but has been taken off the ventilator and is now talking. The man accused of stabbing Rushdie pleaded not guilty on Saturday to charges of attempted murder and assault.
Number 4.
She was beaten, raped and shot twice just yards from her family's isolated farmhouse in 1946, moments before being brutally attacked. 12-year-old Muriel Drinkwater had waved to her mother, who stood at the kitchen window, as she made her way home from Gowerton High School, along the long path that led to the family home. But Muriel, who was known locally as the Little Nightingale because of her beautiful singing voice, never made it home. She was pulled from that path into the woodland beside it, attacked and murdered amongst the undergrowth of Penlurgur Woods, near Swansea, just yards from safety. Her killer has never been caught, and it remains among the most notorious unsolved murders in Welsh history. Now, a team of former detectives and crime experts have re-investigated the case, dubbed the Little Red Riding Hood murder, and have uncovered a new prime suspect. They pieced together evidence from the time, used new forensic breakthroughs and links to other cases in the area to identify who they think murdered Muriel in the most horrific way. But the mystery doesn't end there, and the team want to unlock the mystery behind a book belonging to Muriel that turned up in a charity shop decades after her death. Filmed as part of documentary Darkland, Hunting the Killers, that is being shown on BBC Wales, the name of murderer Ronnie Harries, the last man to have been hanged in Carmarthen, has been put forward by the team that is headed by the former chief constable of Dyfed Powys Police Jackie Roberts. Harries bludgeoned 2 of his relatives to death with a hammer when they wouldn't let him borrow their car. Their bodies were found buried in a Carmarthenshire kale field in 1953. Muriel was skipping through the woods on the afternoon of June 27, 1946, as she did every day on her way from school, when the summer's afternoon turned to tragedy. Former Detective Inspector Paul Bethel, who was in charge of South Wales Police's cold case team, explained in the documentary, "We know Muriel used to catch the school bus from the school to the gateway off the main road which led to the forestry, and then she would walk about a mile through the forestry, along the lane to the farmhouse." Police records from the time show that Muriel's mother was the last person to see her alive. Paul says, "Muriel had almost made it to the home. From the statements of the day it appeared her mum was making a pot of tea and looked out the window, and actually saw Muriel about 500 yards away coming up the track towards the farmhouse. She disappeared around the bend into some more dense undergrowth. She lost sight of her for a few moments. The crime scene is a short distance from the farmhouse. She had been attacked on the lane, and then she was dragged to where the body was left." In the days and weeks that followed, police officers visited every farmhouse and cottage within 150 square miles, along with interviewing 20,000 men in Swansea, Aberdeen and Carmarthenshire. Yet, despite their exhaustive inquiries, not to mention the discovery of the gun used in Muriel's shooting, the culprit managed to evade justice. But in 2003, when the case was reopened for review, forensics experts had a major breakthrough when they found a semen stain on Muriel's coat. The coat had been lying forgotten in police storage for decades, but after much searching was found by retired DCI Bethel's cold case team. and is thought to be one of the oldest pieces of crime scene evidence in the world. "I found the original clothing," he said, "and we know, even though it had been 60 years since it went into storage, that it is hers. Her name was written in copper plate, Muriel J. Drinkwater, and they were examined by the forensic expert who did some incredible work for us, and was able to find this full crime stain on the back of Muriel's little school Mac. We know 100% that it is the killer's stain. There is no doubt about that." Forensic scientist Dr. Colin Dark said that the stain had been found on the lower flap of Muriel's coat. He described the search for the clothes that had been taken from the crime scene. "We had access to the files and identified that a semen stain had been found on the coat. The hardest part then was actually finding the materials," he told the documentary. "Looking through the paperwork, we could see the materials had left the crime scene, where it had gone, where it had been examined. We could see it had been in a police station, but as it closed, where did it go next? It was tracked down to a storeroom in a current police station in a very dark corner. People had forgotten it was there. We got a partial profile, given that it was the oldest cold case with a semen stain on it that we had been working on. That DNA was initially used to rule from suspicion someone who had been spotted close to the woods on the afternoon Muriel was attacked. It was also tested against the DNA of one Harold Jones, a convicted double child murderer who slayed two similarly young girls in Abertillery in the 1920s, to see if he might be the perpetrator. He could not be placed at the scene, and the DNA ruled him out of the investigation. Forensic historian Nell Darby found similarities in the case of Muriel Drinkwater and the later Ronnie Harry's farmhouse murders in old newspaper articles from the time. She said, "He came to public attention in the early 1950s when he was convicted of murdering an older couple. This was a big news story at the time. He clearly wasn't very bright, and there's evidence that you see of overkill with Muriel Drinkwater's case as well." Just before his execution, Harries gave an extraordinary interview to the tabloid press from his jail cell. Ms. Darby says, "He denied killing his relatives at all. He can't understand why people would think he killed them. He also fixates on the fact that he is married to a younger woman, that she is 5 years younger than him, that she started going out with him when she was still in school. He is very clearly interested in the fact that she is young, that she is a schoolgirl, and also that she is very clever. She goes to grammar school. It does make you think that Muriel Drinkwater, who passed her 11 plus to get into grammar school, is the sort of girl he would have been interested in. Given the sheer level of violence that he inflicted on his own relatives, I can't quite believe that this would be the first instance of his violence." Another witness came forward to tell the team that Ronnie Harries had worked on a farm in Penlurgur, evidence that was supported from a newspaper cutting at the time. It was an article that said that Harries had worked for Muriel's father John at the time of her murder. The team tracked down Harries' cousin Lynn Hughes, who described how the only child had been spoilt by his parents and was very childish. "I was about 9 at the time and he was about twice my age, but I felt, at 9, that I was his intellectual superior," he said. "That sounds pompous, but I knew that really he was a simpleton, but I didn't detect any menace in him." During the course of the investigation, the finger of blame had sometimes been pointed at Muriel's father John. The detectives in the program got a breakthrough when they were able to track down Muriel's relative Martin Phillips, who had been 6 at the time of the murder. He agreed to give a DNA sample that could rule out Muriel's father from the investigation. Martin well remembers a young girl who was always full of life and would always be skipping and singing. In the program, former Dyfed Powys Chief Constable Jackie Roberts traveled to meet him, and he told her how his grandparents, Muriel's parents, had changed after the murder. They had been regular churchgoers, but stopped going to church and moved away from the farm within 2 years of the murder. It was the first time he had spoken publicly about the tragedy that haunts his family to this day. "The farm was a painful place for my grandparents to be," said Martin, who still keeps a little battleship toy that Muriel had given him. "My grandparents changed completely. They never recovered. You are talking about 74 years ago now, and nothing has been able to close the matter." The team also uncovered a book that had once belonged to Muriel, but was found in a Carmarthen charity shop. The team are still investigating if this has any relevance to the case, and are appealing for anyone with information about it to come forward. DNA was taken from the relatives of both Muriel and Ronnie Harries, but the results have not been made public, South Wales Police said. All historic murder cases, often referred to in the media as cold cases, are allocated to the Specialist Crime Review Unit and remain under active consideration and will be subject of re-investigation as and when new information is received or when there are advances in forensic science. Each case is reviewed periodically. If information comes in from the public or other forces, we act on it. South Wales Police has had considerable success with cold case reviews, being one of the first forces in the country to set up a review team in 1999 to conduct cold case reviews.
Number 5.
One of New Zealand's richest men has been named as a possible suspect in the 1970 Crewe murders that saw Pukekohe farmer Arthur Allen Thomas convicted but later pardoned for, and in another shock development, the lead detective on the case has been implicated as the man who married, then murdered the woman who fed baby Rochelle Crewe. It's already been made into a movie and been the subject of more than a half-dozen books, but the unsolved 1970 murders of farming couple Jeanette and Harvey Crewe continue to be the true crime mystery that keeps on giving. Saturday's New Zealand Herald carries the story of a Scrooge who gave his $122 million fortune to the Catholic Church because of a long-standing grudge against his stepchildren. What few knew is that the Scrooge in question, the late Harold Plumley, was once named as a potential suspect in the Crewe murders, and his brother-in-law was none other than Detective Inspector Bruce Hutton, the police officer who locked up Arthur Allen Thomas, using planted evidence to get the conviction. A tangled web. You don't know the half of it. In a nutshell, the Plumley family had farmed land around Mangier for generations, but as a young man Harold Plumley ended up disinherited of virtually everything except a few paddocks left to him in East Tamaki by his mother, while his sister Mary Plumley inherited virtually all of the family estate. Harold Plumley eked out a living in the Pukekohe district, selling agricultural equipment to farmers. At the same time, his wealthy sister Mary was capturing the eye of married Otahuhu police officer Bruce Hutton. Former colleagues of Harold Plumley approached Investigate magazine more than a decade ago with bombshell allegations that Plumley had been sexually rebuffed by a Pukekohe woman he referred to as Jeanette, and that he was going to get her. That conversation took place some months before Jeanette and Harvey Crewe's bloodstained home was found empty in June 1970. Except for baby Rochelle in her cot. As the witnesses tell the story, they speculate that Harold Plumley may have killed the Crews, but his strong sense of Catholic guilt wouldn't allow him to kill the child. Instead, Sister Mary Plumley was roped in to feed baby Rochelle while she was dating Bruce Hutton. Here's the statement Investigate was given in 2008. Names were redacted from what we published back then, and in the 2010 book, The Inside Story. This is the first time we have published the names. I have had information since 1970 that I have been far too frightened to release. I made an effort to inform the police in 1970 and spoke to a Sergeant Johnston. I shall never forget his name, and outlined what I knew about some people that should be interviewed. Imagine my surprise when he went right off the rails and told me that if I ever rang the police with that information again, or made any attempt to have it made known, then I would be the next bastard found in the river. Further, now he had my name, and I was to shut my bloody mouth forever over this matter. Sergeant Johnston is now dead. However, with the information that I have, I am still a threat because all of his buddies are not dead. The main threat is Bruce Hutton, and what I believe I know about him could see him jailed for the rest of his miserable life. I approached Mr. John Carter, our local MP, about 18 months ago around the end of 2006 or start of 2007, and he has been made aware of a snippet of my information. It was enough for him to send me the name of a certain police district commander. However, I will not divulge any information unless I am 100% assured that anything I disclose will be given absolute confidentiality, and my name, etc., is to also be 100% confidential, something I was not given by the police commander at the time. I still have genuine concerns for my safety. After receiving that message, Investigate quickly made contact and promised confidentiality until we had discussed it further. We then met to discuss the revelation in greater detail, and he agreed I could run a story on the issue as long as I kept his identity confidential. He gave me both a written statement and a verbal interview, the gist of which is this. During my many visits to farms in the Tuakau area, says the new witness, I became aware of an agricultural contractor by the name of Harold Plumley, who was actively engaged visiting many dairy and other farmers in Tuakau, Onuero and the surrounding areas, relating to their farming needs and problems. The witness says he came to know Plumley and his blonde-haired sister through their mutual work in the farming sector, covering the greater South Auckland and North Waikato areas. At one of their meetings, the man named as a new person of interest in the Harvey and Jeanette Crewe homicide investigation confided about how the farmers' wives often made advances towards him when their husbands were out working on the farms when he called, and he seemed happy to be able to talk or boast about this. However, on one of my last visits, he was very agitated over some woman by the name I thought sounded like Jeanette. He pronounced it as Jeanette, who was not happy with him for some unknown reason, and had evidently threatened to tell her husband about that matter. This obviously had infuriated Plumley, as he stated that a woman like her could ruin his business and his reputation, and if it became public, it would cause further alienation of his relations that I had already sensed were not great between himself and his family, and he wouldn't let that happen. Plumley went on to mention that he would finally get her. I presumed from past discussions that he meant he would win her over. However, at this time it was no concern of mine, and it appeared to me he was letting this matter consume him, and the rejection of his advances, whatever they may have been, were definitely not appreciated. The witness described Harold Plumley as a man quick to anger, with a very vehement nature, and prone to violent, verbal outbursts. Although surprisingly, he never swore. Although he discussed his farm meetings and meeting farmers' wives openly to me, I cannot recall him swearing, and can't remember him doing so during any of his conversations with me, and I thought that was rather odd at the time, given the nature of his ramblings. The witness told me he paid no further attention to the man's exploits until Jeanette and Harvey Crewe were found to have been murdered at their farm in June 1970, a little while later. As I had worked in the area and down the same road as the murders, I took an interest in the proceedings. I personally never visited the Crewe's farm, and I could not honestly say if they were milking cows or running dry stock. However, I was more than surprised to learn that Arthur Allen Thomas had been charged with the murders. I had met briefly with Mr. Thomas on 2 occasions, once in Warkworth when I visited a neighbor of his father's, and once when I called at his farm. On each of these meetings, although brief, I found Mr. Thomas to be an extremely polite and quietly spoken man, and if anything a little naive, but in no way would I have ever expected him to be a man capable of murder. As the information started to roll in over this case, it was public knowledge that a blonde woman was seen at the Crewe's house, and it was openly reported that she had possibly been the person who fed the baby Rochelle. Who was she? This has been one of the most asked questions and one of the conundrums of this most infamous murder mystery. The 18-month-old baby was found in her cot at the Crewe's farm, and there was evidence that she had been fed and had had her nappies changed during that time. Harold Plumley's comment to me about a woman named Jeanette threatening to tell her husband about some matter came chillingly back to me, especially due to the fact I had seen his previous violent verbal outbursts. The man's sister, a woman who doted on her brother despite his status as black sheep of the family, was fair-haired. The witness, who knew her personally as well, has exceptionally good reason to believe the woman agreed to help her brother after the fact, because of the shame it would bring to their prominent family name. He believes the sister was undoubtedly the woman who fed baby Rochelle Crewe, and who has never been identified by police, at least publicly. Having thought about this matter, the witness told me, I then phoned the police. I asked to speak to the senior officer in charge and I relayed my suspicions to him and the names I had. Instead of showing any interest, I was shouted at over the phone, told never to ring the F King police again about this matter, and if you do you'll be the next F King person to be found in the river. I was also told that the police knew who the murderer was and to butt out completely or else. To say I was scared over this reaction would be an understatement, records the witness, which is why it took him 38 years to come forward with the information. But the shock value does not end there. Detective Inspector Bruce Hutton married Mary Plumley, the woman the witness speculates fed baby Rochelle, putting him within a heartbeat of the Plumley family, millions if she died. Serendipitously, on 15 February 1985, That moment arrived. Mary and Bruce Hutton were visiting close friends in Wachanga, one of whom was her doctor. Mary advised she was going inside to wash sea salt out of her hair. A while later, Bruce Hutton told the inquest, the doctor's wife, Anne Kellaway, found 53-year-old Mary naked and unresponsive, curled up in a bath with only 1½ inches, 4 centimeters of water in it. The plug was in, the tap was turned off. Who runs a 4 centimeters deep bath to wash their hair? It's a question that has never been credibly answered. Bruce Hutton told the coroner, Gavin and I ran inside and found Mary curled up in the bath. We got her out and Gavin started external massage, and I did the mouth-to-mouth. It was no use as she had already gone. Her family doctor Gavin Kellaway pointedly provided absolutely no evidence to the coroner's inquest beyond his signature on the 15/85 death certificate, where he stated he had last seen Mary alive at 14:20 that afternoon, and she was in good health. There was no witness statement corroborating Hutton's version of events, describing the scene they found or the resuscitation efforts. Nothing. Nor was there a witness statement from Anne Kellaway, purportedly the woman who discovered the body. Perhaps his evidential silence was deliberate, given what we now know. Better to say nothing than lie on oath. And after all, who could Kellaway have turned to? The police. Bruce Hutton was the police, a man so revered that Police Commissioner Mike Bush was still singing Hutton's praises at his 2013 funeral. A Waikato hospital pathologist was the only medic to testify, ruling Mary had suffered a heart attack, loss of consciousness and drowned, even though the autopsy found no water in the lungs to corroborate the drowning in an inch of water claim. Again, who climbs into a 4 centimeters deep bath, turns off the tap, assumes the fetal position, then drowns, simultaneously causing a myocardial ischemic event, yet without inhaling water? The autopsy found no external evidence of violence or external injury. That's odd, because if a naked woman was genuinely standing in an inch of bath water and keeled over with a heart attack, you would expect the falling body to collide with taps or the side of the bath on the way down. Yet there was not a mark on her. Bruce Hutton was the sole heir of Mary's fortune, around $10 million in today's money. One man who wasn't buying the death by drowning claim was Harold Plumley. I knew this because when I rang him seeking comment on the allegation that he had killed the Crews, which he denied, he instead begged me to investigate what he insisted was the murder of his sister by former police officer Bruce Hutton. He killed her, he claimed, to get his hands on the money. He manipulated the will. He was only after her coin. Intriguingly, the majority of bath electrocutions leave no visible marks, and pathologists have difficulty distinguishing them from ordinary heart attacks. One of the signs of a bathtub electrocution, reports one 2018 medical study, is left ventricular failure due to cardiac fibrosis after electric injury, which is interesting because the Mary Hutton autopsy found in the myocardium of the left ventricle there is interstitial fibrosis and fragmentation of fibers is also seen. Another study found 90% of electrocution deaths show signs of myocardial fiber breakup. The frequency of MFB was maximal in cases of electrocution, 90%. The findings show that MFB is an antemortem change, and may be a distinct finding in electrocution. Yet another study backs that up, saying myocardial fiber damage is much more common in electrocutions than ordinary sudden deaths. Pathologic changes in internal viscera included disarray of myocardial fibers. Rupture of myocardial fibers was more readily identified than in non-electrocution death. Yet inexplicably, the implausibility of drowning in 4 centimeters of water, even though the lungs were found to be dry, doesn't seem to have crossed the mind of the pathologist examining Mary Hutton's body. Nor does the heart damage she found that is now regarded as a biomarker of electrocution. But then again, they didn't know as much back in 1985, and neither the family doctor whose home the tragedy occurred at, nor Mary's former police officer husband, mentioned anything about a hairdryer or a heater being found in the bath, so the pathologist had no reason to suspect foul play. Bruce Hutton, meanwhile, was busily counting his millions. Why wasn't there a police investigation? Well, maybe there was. Arthur Allen Thomas's brother Day told me in 2008 that a Pukaka man who he knew had contacted him at one point to tell him Bruce Hutton had killed Mary Plumley Hutton. He rang me up once and told me that Hutton had thrown an electric heater in her bath. This fella that told me He's got cops that he's friendly with, and they told him. Thomas says he told TVNZ's Sunday program of the Hutton allegations, but nothing eventuated. In a 2008 phone interview, Harold Plumley told me that he and Bruce Hutton had antagonism toward each other caused by Hutton's relationship with Mary, and he believed that was why police had never questioned him about the Crewe murders. I didn't have anything to do with it, didn't know them, although I did drive past their farm every day at the time, still do occasionally because of my work as a farm consultant. In a later phone interview, despite initially saying he didn't know them, Plumley would emphatically describe Harvey Crewe as just a bum no money. A pipsqueak cattle agent who married into money. And when I asked if the Crewe farm was dairy or dry stock, his answer was instant. Dry stock. But Plumley's next revelation was earth-shattering. I know what led to Mary and Hutton going away to that break in Wachanga. Our father told me after her death. He said that 4 days beforehand, Mary came to him and said, "I'm very worried." Dad explained that she and Hutton had been really rowing. Father said she told him it's got to end. It's got to end. And when I come back, I'm going to the lawyers. I've got to get rid of him. I've got to get him out. That is absolutely clear-cut. That I've given you gospel truth, Plumley told Investigate. So here's the lie of the land. Days before her mysterious drowning in just over 1 inch of bathwater, wealthy heiress Mary Plumley Hutton told her father she was planning to divorce former Detective Inspector Bruce Hutton. She never got to see her lawyer, and she never survived the weekend getaway where she planned to thrash things out. Plumley says he tried to talk to Mary's Fijian maid Miriana after the death, but found himself hauled in for questioning by Atahuhu Sib for harassment. I really gave Det Mitford Burgess a lashing in front of the whole Sib, Plumley recalled, but that's what happened. Hutton found out I was asking questions, and suddenly the police were investigating me. Plumley got the last laugh. However, while Hutton inherited Mary Plumley's estate, worth around $10 million in today's money, left to her by her father, Harold Plumley's paddock in Ormiston Road, East Tamaki, given him by his mother, was sold to Lion Breweries for $66 million in 2007 as the site of its New Zealand headquarters. By the time he died in 2016, Plumley's fortune had ballooned to $122 million, which he bequeathed to the Catholic Church in New Zealand's biggest ever charitable donation. Do I believe Harold Plumley killed the Crews? Although Plumley's former colleague believed it, and Plumley knew more about the Crews than he originally let on, there's insufficient evidence. As for Detective Inspector Bruce Hutton, the top cop who conspired to plant evidence to gain a conviction in the Crewe murders, the man of whom police bosses famously remarked at his 2013 funeral his integrity is beyond reproach, a new stain now clouds his legacy. Did he murder his own wife to seize her fortune?
Number 6.
How did a jealous penniless actor end up shot twice in the head outside the back of his former home, carrying a homemade kosh in his pocket? And why did neither his former lover or son, who were in the flat above, not investigate? Historian Jan Bondison tells the story of the Clifty Gardens mystery, and why the flat's location was a mystery for decades. Thomas Weldon Anderson, born in late 1861, changed his name to Weldon Athearstone when he became an actor. A tall, handsome man with an excellent voice, he specialized in Shakespearean productions. He married young actress Monica Kelly in 1888 and they had a son, Thomas Frederick Anderson. The crime writer Isabel Mary Thorne, pen name Elizabeth Villiers, claimed the actor was an angry, jealous man, and the baby of forlorn mite, with bickering parents. The couple did have another son, William Gordon Anderson, and 2 daughters. Weldon Athearstone kept touring in the 1890s, but never progressed to more important roles. In the late 1890s, he left his wife for good. In July 1899, when in the play The Power of Gold at the Theatre Royal in Sheffield, he met the young actress Elizabeth Earle. She was pretty, with soulful eyes and a mass of curly hair. They fell in love. She moved in with her mother in a ground-floor flat at number 17 Clifton Gardens in Prince of Wales Road, Battersea in 1902. Atherstone lived there when he was not on tour. Number 17 Clifton Gardens is a 3-story building with a flat on each floor. Ground floor flats had a tiny front enclosure and a small yard at the rear. There was a small alleyway between number 17 and 19, a school at the time, with only a small wall between the two. Old Mrs. Earl died in 1905, and Elizabeth made her living teaching students at the Academy of Dramatic Arts and private pupils in her flat. The two Anderson boys worked as East London labouring men, and she gave them some acting lessons for free. The boys became very fond of her, but Weldon Atherstone's acting career was slowly going downhill. He would recite the ballads of George R. Sims at music halls, and could still enthrall audiences, but rowdy yobs would sometimes mimic his sonorous voice, using naughty phrases of their own. In 1906, Miss Earle's flat was burgled and gas meter broken open. The former actress began to worry. The landlord offered her the first-floor flat instead. In January 1907, there was a strike among music hall performers for better pay and conditions. Weldon Atherstone was one of the blackleg performers at the Euston Palace of Varieties. He shared the stage with American singer Belle Elmore, also known as Mrs. Cora Crippen, wife of a doctor. As the years went by, Weldon Atherstone became increasingly paranoid. He was jealous of Elizabeth Earle and forbade her to take any male drama students, fearful they might have impure designs on her. When Atherstone went to see Elizabeth Earle in May 1910, he challenged her about entertaining a lover. He struck her across the face. Hargrave Adam, a crime writer with good police contacts, said Atherstone was familiar in lowly pubs near the Strand. In the evening of July 16, 1910, the now 35-year-old Elizabeth Earle was with Thomas Frederick Anderson, 21, in her flat. There were 2 loud shots from the rear yard. Elizabeth thought someone was shooting cats, but young Anderson speculated the shots might have been designed to frighten off a burglar. Neither of them went downstairs to investigate, but soon a police sergeant came to number 17. Chauffeur Edward Noyce had at Battersea Bridge Road police station reported 2 shots, and a man leaping down from the wall of number 19 Clifton Gardens and running down Rosenau Road towards the river. Elizabeth Earle told him that she had also heard the shots. Anderson accompanied the policeman down the cast iron stairs into the rear yard. They found an unconscious man lying in the downstairs scullery. He had been shot twice in the head, and one eye was hanging down his cheek. 2 doctors arrived, but the victim died soon after. Thomas Frederick Anderson showed no sign of recognizing him. Police found the victim was carrying a large, homemade cosh and was wearing carpet-bag slippers. Detective Inspector Jeek, who took charge of the case, also found a business card. He asked young Anderson if he knew a Weldon Atherstone. Thomas could not believe his father was the victim, but later, at the mortuary, he immediately identified the Clifton Gardens murder victim as his father. So who were the suspects in the murder? The police suspected the young man seen leaving the crime scene after the shots rang out was the murderer. The chauffeur Edward Noyce and 4 witnesses who had seen the fugitive running down Rosenau Road towards Petworth Street described him as 23 to 30 years old, between 5 feet 3 inches and 5 feet 6 inches tall. Mr. Noyce was certain the man he had seen was not the tall, lanky Thomas Frederick Anderson. At the inquest, it was suggestive Weldon Atherstone had gone to number 17 Clifton Gardens to spy on Elizabeth Earle, armed with a cosh. His pocketbook had cryptic notes indicating he was convinced Miss Earle was seeing a rival. But the 4 men named in the pocketbook were all cleared by police. Newspaper headlines were dominated by the sensational Crippen case, in which Atherstone's erstwhile acting colleague had been found murdered at number 39 Hilldrop Crescent. But there was speculation Atherstone had arranged a meeting with a rival on the fatal evening. Elizabeth Earle gave the impression of being prostrate with grief, but she did not attend Atherstone's funeral, nor did the actor's widow. All 4 children were there, and many old theatrical colleagues sent wreaths. In illustrations, Weldon Atherstone is handsome and youthful looking, but Thomas Frederick Anderson is awkward looking, with a long nose and a pinched face, and much older than 21. Elizabeth Earle is the same as the youthful looking photograph of her. The change in the shape of her face was down to ill-fitting dentures. It was rightly considered peculiar that she and Thomas Frederick Anderson had not investigated the gunfire in their small rear yard. Young Anderson faced questions about failing to recognize his father, but blamed the darkness of the evening and the facial injuries. His younger brother William Gordon Anderson had attended a cricket match in Willesden and then returned to his lodgings. The inquest returned a verdict of murder, and their matters have rested ever since. Most commentators say the morbidly jealous Atherstone had gone to spy on Miss Earle, but a burglar burst into the yard, and when the actor attacked him, he was gunned down. Hargrave Adam, who saw a file on the case, suggested Atherstone had brought the gun along, but it had been turned against him in the struggle. Crime historian Jonathan Goodman's theory was that Elizabeth Earle had conspired with the two Anderson brothers to murder Atherstone, an unsatisfactory lover and father, and a lousy actor who was sponging on them. Or had the killer's intention merely been to give Atherstone a fright, or beat him up, only for things to go wrong? Nor is there an obvious motive for the murder. The two Andersons appear to have been closer to their father than their mother, and the Elizabeth Earle does not seem like a suitable person for a murderous conspiracy. The burglar hypothesis is in my mind fully credible, but why would an armed burglar want to break into a house in a lower-class part of London, wearing an elegant suit? Homegrown burglars seldom carried loaded firearms. At one stage, I had suspicions against Miss Earle. Had she also changed her name for her acting career, or married another in secret under her real name? But my old friend, the late Richard Whittington Egan, has demonstrated Elizabeth Earle was born in America in 1875. She had not even lied about her age. The murder house at number 17 Clifton Gardens has long been presumed to be lost. There is no Clifton Gardens today, nor in early editions of Bartholomew's reference Atlas of Greater London. Richard Whittington Egan pointed out that Clifton Gardens was not situated off Prince of Wales Road, but actually in that street. It was once the name for the terrace of houses between Battersea Bridge Road and Rosenau Road. One of the houses still has a plaster plaque saying Clifton Gardens. The layout of the murder house at number 17 has not changed much since 1910. No blood-stained spectre wearing carpet-bag slippers has haunted it, waving its cosh about in rage. In his collection, Richard Whittington Egan had the carved stone figure of the head of a man from above the portico of a house in Rosenau Road, the sole surviving witness to the flight of the Clifton Gardens murderer. Sometimes London's most fascinating mysteries are its forgotten ones.
Number 7.
Sharron Kim Pryor was born on February 9, 1959, to Mom Yvonne and Dad George. She would later welcome several younger siblings, including a foster brother. Sharron grew up in Point St. Charles, sometimes spelled Point St. Charles, a neighborhood in Montreal, Quebec in Canada. Loved ones said she had a radiant smile, and that people loved being around her. Sharron was athletic and, like many Canadians, enjoyed playing hockey. She was also very cautious and didn't get into trouble a lot, aspiring one day to be a veterinarian. Saturday, March 29, 1975, was the day before Easter. Around 7:15 that evening, 16-year-old Sharron left her house to meet some friends at a local pizza parlor. The walk should have only taken her about 5 minutes, but she never showed up. It's not clear if her friends actually expected her there. When she wasn't home by 1 a.m., Yvonne Pryor got worried. Her daughter was usually home by this time, and always called if she was going to be late. The search for Sharron began right away, with police and volunteers alike turning up to look. 3 days later, on April 1st, Sharron's body was found in a field in Longwool, about 12 kilometers, 7.5 miles, from Point St. Charles. She'd been beaten, raped and strangled, the latter of which likely caused her death. Her body had been dragged under a tree, and she still had a tree branch in her hand. Her jeans and underwear were found near her body, the latter hanging from a branch. There was tape in her hair that had presumably been put over her mouth as a gag. Police also found a padlock, shirt, tire marks and a footprint nearby. The padlock was opened, but there were no signs of force. The shirt was worn by someone about 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, and police believed it was also used to tie Sharron up. The footprint was made by someone who wore about a size 8.5 shoe. Sharron had been dead for about a day when her body was found. Police believe she'd been held captive, then dragged to the scene and left there while she was still alive. But other than this evidence, there wasn't much to go on. They interviewed 38 people, 6 of whom they considered suspects, but all were ultimately let go. The investigation stalled and was later reopened in the early 2000s. In 2004, police got a tip that led them to a garage behind an apartment building not too far from Sharron's old house. About 24 officers searched the garage for 15 hours, looking for evidence that Sharron had been there at some point. DNA samples were sent off for results, but ultimately found no matches. 70 potential suspects have been looked into, but as of March 2022, no arrests have been made. So what happened to Sharron Pryor? Police believe there are at least 2 people involved in her murder. I could never find a specific reason why they believe this, but author Alice DeSterler at Defrosting Cold Cases gives some insight. Remember, the shirt found at the scene was thought to be worn by someone who was about 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, and the footprint was made by a size 8.5 shoe. According to DeSterler, a man of the size and height to wear that shirt would be more likely to wear a larger shoe. Sharron's mom, Yvonne Pryor, wonders if her daughter may have been the victim of a serial killer. Multiple cases have been noted, both by her and online sleuths, of other female murder victims in Canada who were similar in age and looks to Sharron. There's also speculation that she was killed by a trucker, which is a very common theory in unsolved cases, and one I've discussed in multiple videos. There's also speculation that Sharron's killer, or killers, knew the area well. The owner of the field Sharron was found in only discovered her remains when he realized the gate leading into the field was open. If it hadn't been for this, she likely wouldn't have been found until later on in the spring. Did Sharron's killer leave her in a place where they thought she wouldn't be found for months, perhaps hoping that much of the evidence would have decayed or been destroyed by then? Whatever happened, Sharron's murder has gone unsolved for almost 47 years. Her loved ones hope that advances in DNA technology or someone coming forward with previously withheld information will one day solve this case.
Number 8.
The Wonderland murders have been unsolved for decades, though 2 people have been brought to trial, both of whom were acquitted. When Alice fell down the rabbit hole and landed in Wonderland, she found smoking caterpillars, violent denizens, and a trove of body-altering drugs. Of course, that was just a children's tale, but the real-life Wonderland wasn't far off. A drug house on Wonderland Avenue, high above the Sunset Strip, that hosted the seedy site of Law's up-and-comers. It housed hundreds of thousands of dollars in drugs and, on a vengeful leader's orders, became the scene of a quadruple homicide so bloody that it made the news for decades. Meet the players in La's infamous Wonderland murders today. 8763 Wonderland Avenue in Laurel Canyon is home to a neat little split level with a carport, an iron framework balcony, and a family with a minivan. Nothing on the outside suggests that on July 1, 1981, 4 bodies were discovered there, so beaten and bloody that the LAPD compared them to the Tate LaBianca murders. The house on Wonderland Avenue was home to the members of the Wonderland Gang, Law's most successful distributor of cocaine in the 1970s. Their growing operation had virtually cornered the market. The property was officially leased in Joy Miller's name, but it was home to a rotating cast of characters. Joy was a long-time heroin user who had fallen in with the gang after separating from her wealthy husband and Beverly Hills life. Joy Miller's boyfriend was Billy Deverell, the gang's level-headed second-in-command. Reports would later paint him as a reluctant criminal, one who regretted that his long track record of heroin abuse and resulting arrests made it difficult for him to find and hold other jobs. There was nothing at all half-hearted about Ron Launius's criminal enterprises, though. Launius was Wonderland's king, and he was as cold as ice. He had made a name for himself during the Vietnam War, when he was dishonorably discharged from the army for smuggling drugs back to the United States in the bodies of dead servicemen. Launius had already spent time in jail for smuggling and only narrowly escaped life imprisonment for murder when the prosecution's star witness was killed in an accident. Police didn't think they'd missed their chance, though. By the summer of 1981, Launius was a person of interest in as many as 24 other homicides. Ron Launius's wife, Susan, also lived in the Wonderland house. A drug user like her husband, she largely absented herself from gang activities. The most unusual member of the Wonderland household was John Holmes, the famous pornographer, who was a frequent guest and often purchased or mooched cocaine from the gang. Cocaine wasn't the Wonderland crew's only source of revenue. Heroin was their private passion and armed robbery their side gig. Stealing from their rivals was both a source of income and an effective way to keep their competitors out of the game until it backfired one terrible, bloody night. On June 29, several days before the Wonderland murders, 4 members of the Wonderland gang robbed the home of notorious club owner and gang leader Eddie Nash. Lanius and Deverell, disguised as police officers, led fellow gang members David Lind and Tracy McCord into the rival leader's home, where they handcuffed Nash and his bodyguard, Gregory Dials. During the robbery, as Nash was being made to open the safe, Lind accidentally shot and wounded Dials. They walked away, unrecognized, with $1.2 million in illegal drugs, cash, jewelry, and arms, the latter belonging to a collection the Wonderland gang itself had sold Nash just days earlier. Though police didn't identify a suspect initially, Nash pointed fingers at several people he knew had been in his home the day of the crime. At the top of his list was John Holmes, who had returned to the house 3 separate times just that morning, presumably, he suspected, to make sure the patio door by which the gang later entered was unlocked. Scott Thorson, the former lover of Liberace, had also been present at Nash's house. Thorson claimed that Nash had been so convinced that Holmes was involved that he had made his injured bodyguard track him down and beat the assailants' names out of him. Though Thorson's claims were never corroborated, in all likelihood they were true. That's because just 2 days after Nash allegedly beat him for information about the assailants, the perpetrators were found brutally bludgeoned in their home. At 4 p.m. on July 1st, police received a panicked phone call from a pair of furniture movers. As they'd been working at the house next door to 8763 Wonderland, they'd heard desperate, pain moans coming from the drug house. Investigators met with a horrible scene. The body of Barbara Butterfly Richardson, David Lynn's girlfriend, was lying on the ground near the couch she had been sleeping on, covered in blood. Joy Miller was found dead in her bed, while Deverell's body was slumped at the foot, leaning against the TV stand. A bloody hammer was tangled in Miller's sheets, and several metal pipes littered the floor. In the neighboring bedroom, Ron Lanius was dead, bloodied and beaten almost beyond recognition. Perhaps the most horrifying sight was Lanius's wife Susan. She was found covered in blood on the floor next to the bed that held her dead husband's body, her skull bashed in, but, miraculously, still alive. The moans that the moving company had heard had been from her. Though she'd survive the attack and make a full recovery, the brain damage she sustained left her with permanent amnesia, unable to recall the events of the Wonderland murders. The police searched the home and interviewed neighbors, who later admitted that they had heard screams in the early hours of the morning, around 3 a.m. Given that the house had a reputation for loud and disruptive behavior at all hours, the neighbors had just assumed the gang was having a party and hadn't bothered to call the cops. Susan Lanius had been lying on the floor alive, with her skull broken, for more than 12 hours. The police search documented in the gruesome Wonderland Murders video revealed a bloody handprint on the headboard above the dead Ron Lanius. It belonged to John Holmes, who was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder. The prosecution argued that he had retaliated against the Wonderland gang after feeling slighted by the division of the spoils from the Nash robbery. But the story wasn't convincing. It seemed more likely to jury and public alike that the porn star had simply been caught in the crossfire, bribed with drugs by the Wonderland gang to unlatch the Nash hideout door, a mission that took several trips. Holmes had made himself a target for Nash, who believed he was a Wonderland accomplice. Nash's men beat Holmes until he agreed to let Nash's men into the Wonderland house. Holmes was acquitted, though since he refused to give any evidence during his trial, he ended up serving 110 days in jail for contempt of court. Attention next turned to Nash. Suspecting Nash had murdered the gang for revenge, police questioned and eventually arrested the rival drug dealer. Charged with planning the murders, Nash was saved by a hung jury. Just one juror stood between Nash and a guilty verdict. Nash walked free until 2000. When he was charged with drug trafficking and money laundering. As part of a plea deal, he admitted to having bribed the single dissenting juror in the original trial. He also confessed to commanding his men to repossess the stolen items in the Wonderland house on the night of the slayings, though he never admitted to having ordered the murders. Today, the Wonderland killings are remembered as one of Hollywood's most gruesome moments, A horror story whose images and video have continued to haunt long after the bodies were buried.